Hello, welcome to the call today. My name is Reverend Bud Heckman. I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Board of Governors of the Religion Communicators Council. You can learn more about RCC, as it's called, on the web at religioncommunicators.org. We have a convention coming up April 5th through the 7th in Atlanta, an annual convention that includes the DeRose Hinkhouse Awards, which are available and open now for applying. The DeRose Hinkhouse Awards recognize excellence for people who are from faith-based institutions that might be members of RCC in their work in communicating about religion, faith, and spirituality. In addition to that, we have the famous Wilber Awards, and in the Wilber Awards, we recognize those persons who are in secular media who actually help to bring attention to the same issues, religion, faith, and spirituality, and the way in which they do their coverage. The RCC is a special treat in terms of the diversity of people that are there at the annual convention and the opportunities and variegation of them to be able to learn. In Atlanta, we'll be focusing on civil rights. As you may know or have in your consciousness, on April 4th, it will be the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. We'll be in Atlanta and actually go to some of the King sites and hear from people that are involved in the historic and modern day struggle for civil rights as part of our conference. Today, we have the pleasure for our webinar of having with us Bob Chase. I came to know Bob through hearing about this famous campaign that he helped champion with the United Church of Christ and other partners about God is Still Speaking. And then I came to know Bob in person when he actually came to apply to be the head of Intersections International, a new international interfaith nonprofit that he gave great shape and color to, based here in New York City, but serving as a global NGO. And recently he has retired from his work in the field and has written a book called Beyond the Comma. He'll be sharing with us about that book and some insights from his historious career in religious communications. So I'm really pleased to introduce to you Bob Chase. As Bob begins to speak, I encourage you to follow along with yourself muted, and then down in the chat box to pose any questions that you might have down in the chat box. Okay, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Bud, and thank you to all of you for participating in this. Thank you to the Religion Communicators Council for hosting this webinar. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts, not only from my career, but more recently from the book that I have written and has been published by Pilgrim Press, called Beyond the Comma. Beyond the Comma was launched on at the end of June this year, and so what I hope to do here today, because of the nature of your work, is to share some of the communication elements that exist in my book, Beyond the Comma. So let me start out by saying that the first thing that I had to do, never having written a book before, really, well, I did many, many years ago, but not for 40 years or so, I had to come to grips with the idea of whether or not I should write the book, take the time to do it, and whether it would have value to the readers. So I wanted to share a little bit from the prologue that addresses that issue. The whole exercise of writing a book implies that you think you have something important to say and others will want to read it. The fear is that you discover your thoughts are too simplistic, too pedestrian, or too obtuse to be of interest to anyone. This is especially true for me, since my life, while full and for which I am grateful, has not seemed particularly remarkable or dramatic or beneficent or filled with self-sacrifice. I am a product of the suburbs. How unimaginative. I'm a white, male, Christian of privilege. No drama there. I've been spared the gut-wrenching tragedies that so often infuse the lives of others who have truly heroic stories to tell. I never went to war or ran for office and never led a movement of any real consequence And so I asked myself in those moments of doubt and disillusionment, what have I to say that could be of value? So putting aside doubts and fears, I wonder if I am not exactly the one who should write such a book. Perhaps if I see myself as painfully normal and then try to extract life lessons from my experience, this will resonate with those who, like me, wonder about who they are and why they are here. I have come across many moments when I thought it would be good and productive to document thoughts and ideas about these intersections in my life. So that's a little bit of an idea about that. Or that's a caveat, I guess, in terms of as I prepared to write this book. But then as I viewed these kind of issues, these internal personal issues, against the backdrop of what's happening in the communications arena, when, as a colleague once told me, the sage on the stage is dead, and with the democratization of media, perhaps there is an audience who can relate to the very issues that I seem to find important in my own life. So, that said, let me just share briefly the structure of the book, and then what we can do is get into some of the substance of the book. So the book is written in short chapters. That's done intentionally so that people can almost use it as a meditative guide. And I've heard from readers who have said they've used it that way, first thing in the morning, late at night before they go to bed, on the bus, that kind of thing. That seems to have worked well. I need to give credit to my editor, Betsy McKaylee, who is a longtime friend and colleague who did a wonderful job working with me in actually getting this book published. It was a great idea, I think, and that structure lends itself to a reading on a regular basis. Each chapter begins with what I might call a thought for meditation, a very brief kind of quote, and I'll share some of those with you through the course of the next several minutes. And then there are basically three threads that exist throughout the book. Personal stories, commentary on sacred texts, and discourse on current political and cultural topics. And it's the weaving of these three threads throughout the book that forms the flow of the narrative. And so I'll share with you now then why I write this book, the objective for me, both in terms of writing it, once I get over the doubts and fears of actually putting my words down on the page, and then what I hope will be the objectives for the reader and why the title that I've chosen. There is I'll say there is a chapter in here that Bud was referencing about the UCC's God is Still Speaking campaign. It's chapter 4 in the book, for those of you who have the book. And I speak a lot about that and the role that the comma played as a graphic image in the UCC's identity campaign. But for me, again, beginning reading at the prologue and then moving into the idea of the title, I share these thoughts with you. I become increasingly aware of the simultaneous intersections that confront us in each moment. In vulnerable times, the confluence of these forces can seem overwhelming. In ordinary times, the tendency is to overlook or ignore these competing dynamics and live one-dimensionally. But if we are to be truly attentive to the seemingly contradictory realities that compete for our attention, existence can be enriched, understanding deepened, and options expanded in limitless ways. Walt Disney built an entire empire based on two such seemingly conflicting ideas: memory, which looks to the past, and imagination, which builds on an illimitable future. When brought into harmony, the deep taproot of past experience merges with an open-ended future inspired by creativity and invention. By making decisions based on both past and future, memory and imagination, the present is expanded exponentially. By the same token, if we live in touch with both our deeply personal realities, while at the same time engaging the global forces that surround us, our sensitivities are heightened and our potential for becoming more creative, sensitive, and productive human beings is enhanced. The title of this narrative points to the punctuation mark that separates all that goes before from all that follows. It is an appropriate demarcation for each of us in that during every instance of our lives, we encounter the eternal moment where past and future meet. Death, then, becomes the ultimate comma, the one aspect of life's journey we all share, complete with its accompanying uncertainty, fear, dread, grief, sense of loss, and, inshallah, hope for a peace that passes all understanding on the other side of the grave. The expression beyond the comma calls us to recognize, realize, even celebrate those moments that continuously offer the possibility that at these comma points, qualitatively new opportunities confront us. And so that's some of my thinking that went both into writing the book and then into using the title that I did. So when I was speaking on the circuit, if you will, during the UCC's identity campaign, I talked often about the importance of punctuation and the comma, and those of you who know the history of the UCC know that you can see commas in UCC churches all over the place still. And the comma became the image for separating all that has come before from all that is to follow. And of course, we use the anecdote from the life of Gracie Allen, that great Jewish philosopher, who said gave a note to her husband, George Burns, on her death that said, "Never place a period where God has placed a comma." And so the UCC took that phrase, which I have felt and still feel is perhaps the best way to describe the theology behind the United Church of Christ, and they created a phrase, "God is still speaking, comma." And that became the foundation for the identity campaign for the UCC. So the comma becomes an important image for the life journey. And that's what I used as kind of the foundation for writing this book. I became totally convinced that I had something here in terms of at least a good hunch about the importance of the comma on one of those great comma moments in American history, the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated. And let me read just a brief paragraph from my book. On the day of Donald Trump's inauguration as the 45th President of the United States, President Barack Obama, a one-time member of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, may have been drawing upon his UCC roots in his very first post-presidency remarks at Andrews Air Force Base. There, he told wary and disheartened followers, quote, "This is just a little pit stop. This is not a period. This is a comma in the continuing story of building America." And so I felt I was in good company by using this symbol, this mark of punctuation, as an identifier for those parts of our lives that things change, and that we can seize on those times to re-navigate or renegotiate aspects of our lives, both internally and integrating those with our social responsibilities in terms of shaping the flow of our lives together. So to talk a little bit then specifically about communications, and there are many aspects of this book that of which communications is only one, but I wanted to focus on that a little bit again because of the nature of your work, and hopefully that will spark some conversation that we will have later in this hour together. Communications have changed radically in recent years. I don't have to tell you that, perhaps more than any other field. But there are basic communications to, basic components, to communications that remain constant. And I wanted to share a story from the book that indicates how I believe we can learn from our very personal anecdotes and illustrations and incidents in our lives to achieve greater kind of global truths. So this, for those of you who have books and might be reading along, starts on page 81. All communications consist of four things: a transmitter, a receiver, a conduit, and noise. My job is often to clearly identify who was transmitting information to whom, how the receivers were getting the message, and what might be in the way of a clear signal. No matter how elaborate the conversations, if these four elements are known and understood, information can be more easily clarified and discrepancies in communication more easily identified. I learned this once as a preteen back in my Levittown days. I grew up in Levittown, by the way, and there are several incidents from my years living in Levittown. Those are punctuated throughout the book. On one of those sultry summer afternoons, when as a 10-year-old, time seemed endless, a friend and I decided that we'd make a telephone using tin cans and a string. And so we strung a long string, maybe 200 feet, between his second floor bedroom and mine, and then went to bed for the evening, planning on holding subversive conversations. Parentheses, it was probably innocuous, though it seemed subversive because we were doing this on our own without parental knowledge or permission. We both fell asleep and awoke the next morning to find that somehow the illicit conversation we had hoped to have had never occurred. What could have gone wrong? I was quick to blame the technology. It just didn't work. But much later, I realized that we had strung our conduit resting against branches of a tree between our two bedrooms, thereby rendering the communication pathway useless. Further, when my father came home from work that evening, he reported that late at night, the night before, he was checking on my siblings and me, and he saw this random string that seemed to run from my nightstand out the window. Not knowing what it was, he yanked it and the line broke. As I encountered communication challenges in the coming decades, I often thought about this preteen experience as I tried to unpack the complexities of our world's most pressing issues and how we might market them to a waiting world. So that's the kind of thing that I was trying to point out in my book, that we experience elements in our lives on a daily basis. And if we're attentive to what the lessons are that are locked in those elements, then we have the opportunity to learn and grow in ways that we hadn't been attentive to before. So in terms of this whole idea of communication, if we can clearly identify these four elements, that is transmitter, receiver, conduit, and noise, keep them in mind, then miscommunication can be minimized. So that's just an important kind of foundational principle in terms of communication that I wanted to share that occurs in the book. So there are two aspects of communication then. One is listening, and the other obviously is talking. Natalie Goldberg, in one of the, and I'll just hold this up so you can see what I'm talking about here. In one of the, one I think you can see this, maybe not, let's see. In one of the thoughts for meditation at the beginning of a chapter, brief kind of quotes that that kind of set the stage for the chapter that's to follow. Natalie Goldberg writes this: writing to is 90% listening. The deeper you can listen, the better you can write. And so that, it seemed to me to be very important advice for me as I set out to write the book, and then as I am now going about the country, talking about the words that I've written. So a couple of things come to mind in terms of listening. The first is that we need to listen to the, we need to expect the unexpected. And the second thing is that we need to listen in ways that are new to us, and we need especially to listen to those voices that are unfamiliar. Some of you know that I spent a lot of time in, not a lot of time, but I spent a lot of energy in working at healing the rift between the United States and Pakistan. I visited Pakistan several times and worked with religious leaders, both in this country and in that country, to seek to build greater communication between our two nations in an effort to ease tensions and build mutual respect and understanding. I want to share with you just a few words on from the book in terms of the role of listening in building those relationships. This is on page 38, those of you who are following along. As Pakistanis went to the polls in 2013, seeking their first democratic transition after a full-term civilian-led government, Americans most frequently heard a narrative about Pakistan as a largely violent and lawless nation, steeped in corruption and plagued by extremism. But this is only part of the story in this diverse and strategically important country, with a large diaspora in the United States. Into this media narrative, Intersections, the company that I worked for, the organization that I worked for at the time, led its annual multi-faith delegation of US religious leaders, community organizers, scholars, and students to meet with Pakistani counterparts. We spent a lot of time listening and heard a perspective that, though sharply critical of US foreign policy, as well as their own, was equally committed to finding mutuality in combating social problems in our respective societies. There was much to learn as we sought to change the story in both countries. We knew the American side of the equation, the cost on American lives and limbs, and the huge financial investment in the global war on terror, the resentment we felt towards Pakistan for being a mercurial ally at best, for harboring Osama bin Laden, for blasphemy laws used to persecute Christians and other religious minorities, and for atrocities against women. But what about the Pakistani side? Were we in the United States aware that the global war on terror had claimed more than 40,000 Pakistani lives? Could we imagine the terror inflicted on a whole population caused by drone strikes? And then the humiliation we heaped on top of the pain because we refused to officially acknowledge that the strikes occurred? We learned that a shift to human security beyond military security and towards improving the quality of life in terms of education, healthcare, and good governance might prove more effective in achieving better US-Pakistani relations than past diplomatic efforts. Then in one of the notes at the end of the book, there is this. Upon returning from our trip, we received an email from Dr. Mumtaz Ahmad, who wrote, and he was one of the organizers of this effort in Pakistan. Quote, "What really surprised and pleasantly at that many of my colleagues here was the modesty and humility they saw in their American guests. It was surprising for them for two reasons. They often find their own religious leaders here mostly stiff-necked and self-righteous, and they thought that all Americans speak like the US officials who visit Pakistan. We expect you to do more. We want you to become good boys. Almost everyone told me that they saw a new face of America, deeply religious, caring, compassionate, humble, and willing to listen with respect and patience. You simply can't imagine, my friends, how important was your trip to Pakistan. It was for the first time that many of us came to know that winning hearts and minds meant something real." And so it was an attempt on our part, those religious leaders, some of you who are on this call were accompanying us there. Those religious leaders came to listen first, to hear the Pakistani story and to share our own story. Our goals were threefold. One, to deepen relationships. Two, to shatter stereotypes. And then three, to engage or build an agenda that would build mutual respect and understanding between our two countries. And so that's what we set out to do. We've taken 6 trips there over the past 5 years, and our efforts, which started very small, mere handful of folks who gathered for the first time in Oman because we were seeking a Muslim majority kind of independent country or a neutral country. And then this last March, which was our last trip there, our sessions had grown to over 100 people in each session, and one of those sessions actually had more than 300 people in it. And we did some amazing things, which if we have some time later, we can talk about in rural Pakistan, doing some interfaith worship with Christian, Muslim, and Jew, actually celebrating at a graveside in rural Pakistan, something that we are told had never happened in that country before. So this is what we were trying to do. We were trying to build these relationships so that we would have a better understanding between our two countries. There are 2 parts of the book. One is on page 92 to 95, and another on page 64 and 65, which I won't read, but just to what they try to do, and I think they're very relevant in terms of this particular webinar, and that is they try to point to some of what the title of this webinar is called in terms of rethinking communication. The first on page 92 to 95 is how we do that individually. What are some of the principles that we can apply to our own lives that will help us to be better communicators, that will help us in our relationships one with another? So I have a few things that would be in summary of this part of the book. First, be genuine. Try to be yourself. Know your true north. What is it that motivates you? Be clear about that. So that's the first thing, be genuine. Second, create safe space. Try not to be in a situation, in a conversation where the person who you are engaging feels uncomfortable or ill at ease or even unsafe. If you can create safe space, you can enhance the conversation. Take care of your language. Language is really important. You all are communicators and you know this, but it's something we often forget. And it's not just the words we say, but of course, how we say them. And then treat potentially volatile moments with tenderness. This is something that is really important in corporate settings or workplace settings, where it's important to to treat the person who may perceive you as an adversary as a colleague and friend, and to do that with tenderness as opposed to some kind of authoritative or authoritarian kind of pronouncement. And then finally, to understand that true dialogue is hard. So we can never forget that. We hear a lot of talk about how we need to have conversation about race. We need to have a conversation about workplace safety. We need to have a conversation about the power differential. But true dialogue is difficult, and we need to keep that in mind. In terms of organizationally, on pages 64 and 65, just a few quick principles. Create intersections, not boundaries. Again, listen. Listening is so important. Understand as an organization the power of new technology, and that there needs to be a new technology component in your the way you reach out to others. And then have many voices at the table, and sometimes surprising voices at the table. When I was at Intersections, we used to include artists and dancers at some of our political conversations, and people would at first say, why are they here? And then it would become apparent that that lens that they bring to the conversation is really important. And then finally, promote imagination. And I will go to that now. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to share with you, but we're already over the time. So I'm just going to conclude with some of my thoughts about the ultimate comma. I mentioned it before. The ultimate comma being death. And the last paragraph, and again, taking the thought for meditation from the last chapter, and taking the thought for meditation from the last chapter, Beyond Death, is a poem from Charles Reznikoff, which I actually saw on a subway, and on the wall of the subway. And it just really struck me, especially those of you of a certain age who can remember the way subways used to go, you'll know this image, and I think it really strikes me as what I believe the idea of death to be. Reznikoff writes, if there is a scheme, perhaps this too is in the scheme, as when a subway car turns on a switch, the wheels screeching against the rails, and the lights go out, but are on again in a moment. And I think that that's just a really, really powerful statement about the comma that is death, and what lies beyond the comma. And then the concluding paragraphs in the book itself says this: perhaps it is imagination that is key, that human quality that moves us to dare to dream, that emboldens us, that dimension of our heart and mind and soul that, when coupled with faith, moves us to ever deeper understandings of ourselves and our God, imagination. In this regard, I find one of the most powerful witnesses, not in a futuristic communications expert or some internet guru or a cutting-edge film director, but in the words of a freed slave. In 1773, Phyllis Wheatley became the first African-American author published in North America. For those who have ears, may you hear Phyllis Wheatley's poem on imagination and understand why it is so important that we write the vision and make it plain. Wheatley writes, imagination, who can sing thy force, or who describe the swiftness of thy course? Soaring through the air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace of the thundering God. We on the pinions can surpass the wind and leave the rolling universe behind. From star to star the mental optics rove, measure the skies and range the realms above. There in one view we grasp the mighty whole, or with new worlds amaze the unbounded soul. So, those are some of my thoughts that wander through the life's journey. And again, I thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this. And I will now turn this back to Bud, who will moderate the next portion of our conversation together. Bud?
Sure. I'll give you a brief infomercial for RCC. This is Reverend Bud Heckman. I serve as the president of the Board of Governors for the Religion Communicators Council. You can learn more about us at religioncommunicators.org. Before I continue speaking, though, the reason I'm doing the infomercial now is because I want to give you an opportunity to go to the bottom of your screen if you're participating via Zoom, and in the chat box, pose questions to Bob. We'll start with the questions that appear in the chat box. If we have time left, we'll go to unmuting people that are on the phone lines and so forth to see whether we can take some live callers as well with their questions. We have several questions from Art Cribbs, and I'll pose one of those to Bob here and let him think about it for a moment, and then I'll continue with my infomercial. The question from Art is, how can we listen accurately in new and very different environments? Don't we risk misinterpreting our observations because of our previous experiences and thinking? How do we achieve accurate listening without being informed by previous experiences and thinking? So what Bob thinks about that and how to respond, I'll share with you. The Religion Communicators Council has a special one-day event on January the 26th at the University of Southern California's School of Communications and Journalism, the Annenberg School, in cooperation with University of Southern California's Center for Civic Religion and Culture, the Religion News Association, Claremont School of Theology, and the First United Methodist Church of Los Angeles. The one-day event features many top-level people from Hollywood and top-level religion reporters talking about the enterprise of new developments in religion, old forms of religion that are taking new form and new types of spirituality that are coming into birth, and the mechanisms of communications that occur in those environments. So we're talking about the cutting edge of communication and the cutting edge of formation of religion. In addition to that, we have our annual convention, April 5th through the 7th in Atlanta, Georgia, where we'll be focusing on civil rights, visiting some of the Martin Luther King sites. It is the day following the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, April the 4th. So April 5th and 7th at the Sheraton, Atlanta. You can find out more information on the website for RCC at religioncommunicators.org. And now we'll go back to the questions for Bob, starting with Art's question about how we listen accurately in new and very different environments, and how does our previous experiences and thinking inform that?
Thanks very much, Art. Art was one of those who accompanied us on our trips to Pakistan. So Art, it's good to have you part of this. In response to your question, I would say a couple of things. First is that if you go back to the four elements of all communication processes that I spoke about, the first one of those elements was the transmitter. So the transmitter, or the person who is doing the speaking, to whom we're listening, is an important figure. And if that person is someone from a culture that we are not aware of, or even from life experience that we are not familiar with, it's really important to have a sense of empathy with that person. And a great deal of, especially the early chapters of my book, talk about the importance of empathy. As we are empathetic one with another, we come to see elements in the other as ourselves. And so I would say that it's really important always to keep in mind that the transmitter is, in the case of communications, has distinct properties that need to be honored, recognized, honored, and considered as you hear the message that he or she or an organization is sharing. The second thing that I would say about that, of course, is that the way you do that is through empathy. There is a part in my book where I tell the personal story of being about 11 years old and having my parents, bless their hearts, decide that one of the things I needed to do was learn how to play the guitar. And so I, again, living in Levittown, I had a guitar and not access to transportation to go to my weekly guitar lessons. I, as an 11-year-old with a growing case of acne, very thick lenses, very tall, and carrying an old-style guitar, not a sleek electric model, had to walk about 1.5 miles down Jerusalem Avenue, and I was vilified by people slightly older than me, vilified and criticized in a way that was really, really painful. As I said in my book, every frickin' Tuesday I had to put up with that. It was one of the most painful moments of my life, actually. But later, I came to understand that what that taught me was a sense of empathy. And when I, as a straight white Christian with all kinds of privilege, would be involved in conversations about white privilege, and seem to be empathetic with people of color, people from different lifestyles, people from different socioeconomic situations, people would kind of look askance at me and say, yeah, but he doesn't really understand. And I would often reflect back on those days walking along Jerusalem Avenue and having the catcalls and the critiques and you know, when as an 11-year-old, when those kinds of when that was really important to you, or social acceptability was really important to you, having those cast on me, I often felt that my sense of empathy that I carried with me throughout my life was taken from that moment. So if we can try to put ourselves in the place when we felt least or most like other or most vulnerable, then I think we can listen better.
Great. We have another observation that I'll share from Art. It says, as communicators, we're in the middle person between the originator of the story and the receiver. We are the intersection through which stories are shared. It's an observation that Art had shared, and earlier he had shared, as communicators, we're called to interpret experiences of others and share them with people who are not directly exposed to those events' experiences. How do we confirm the actual experiences to ensure we are transmitting stories accurately? Interesting question in a day of fake news.
Very interesting question. And I think that some of my response would grow out of those principles, both as individuals and as communicators, that I listed or that are listed in the book. Be genuine. Know your true north. In other words, speak truth. There's one story in the book about how I was involved with a client at the time. This was before Intersections, who I knew had imposed all kinds of subtle but clearly racist policies in the way this person carried out his business in banking. And I challenged that. And I remember, I'll never forget him saying, do you have proof? And I said, yes, I do, but I didn't really. As much as I knew, I didn't really have that proof. And that was an important lesson for me, because I again developed empathy for that, how people sometimes get caught up in not telling the truth in this age of fake news, even though it's with the best of motivation, or it addresses a social wrong that we feel passionate about. So know your true north, be genuine, you know, take care of your language, and again, to the best of your ability, keep talking. Share that, share what you learn, keep talking. Don't turn away, don't hide from the truth as you experience it, and be confident that what you are understanding or interpreting is accurate and worth sharing.
I'm going to do the madcap crazy thing of unmuting everybody so that we have people that are on the phone rather than on our computer or using the chat box so they can ask questions. It's a crazy experience. Sometimes it works. Sometimes there's failures with feedback noise. I'll try to do a few clicks. Be patient with us for a moment. So unmuting all. If you have a question for Bob, please go ahead and say it, and we'll just ask all the questions, and I'll go back to a muted status. Anybody have a question for Bob that's not able to ask it in the chat box? Identify yourself, please. Say your name and any questions that you have for Bob.
Bob, this is Art. Can I raise a question again? I've raised several in the chat, though.
Go ahead,
Art. A couple of observations. First, in South Africa, going into a home in a shanty town, and from my U.S. experience, it looked like a very impoverished environment in which a woman and her son lived. Similarly, in Islamabad, when we went to the Christian community, we went into a home, and it was, I don't know, maybe 10 by 10. It was a very close space. And again, through my eyes from the United States, it was very well maintained, very nice furnishings, but a small space. The shantytown in South Africa, similarly, was very small and crowded. The living room, the dining room, the bedroom were all just one space in that 10 by 10. And my question goes back to my previous question. Coming from affluence in the United States into an environment that's very different, immediately I saw poverty until I heard the stories of the woman in South Africa who talked about saving money and buying her home and being a proud owner of her own home, which didn't make her as impoverished as my eyes would suggest. Similarly, we walk into these situations, whether it's religious or political or whatever, from our own lens. And I'm just want to go a little bit deeper on the previous question with you, Bob. How do we, first of all, recognize ourselves as going into an environment from a previous place, with a previous place of comfort and knowing, and discovering we don't even begin to know what we're seeing or understanding?
I'm going to ask you to hold that. That's a terrific question, Art. I'm going to ask you to hold that, Bob, just while the lines are open to see whether there are any additional persons that have had the courage or the technological wherewithal to now ask a question as well. Anyone else who's on who has a question for Bob? Okay, I'm going to go back to a muted status. And Bob, you should be unmuted again now, and hopefully you can answer Art's question.
Art, you raised one of the most difficult questions for anyone who is in the communications business. And I would again say that a couple of things need to guide how we serve as that intermediary, that is the conduit. See, then we become the conduit in many ways between the transmitter and the new the new receiver, who is the audience that we would be speaking to. And we have to be attentive to the noise in our own lives. And part of that, and this is why the whole question of white privilege is such a difficult issue in our society, because we who are white and privileged can be totally unaware of the noise, if you will, in our own lives, and how we approach a situation seemingly with objectivity, and yet it is clouded by this this reality of privilege that we have had, many of us, since birth. And so there's that piece. This is again something that's really troublesome right now, in the issue that's happening in terms of the Me Too campaign and in workplace environments where men are kind of have become blind to behavior that is disrespectful, offensive, and even invokes a lack of safety or hostility and worse. And it's important for us to understand that this noise exists in our own lives and that we need to hear others. We need to hear those who are transmitting pain or pride, as you experienced, Art, in terms of the woman from South Africa. And we need to hear that and then try and feel that or incorporate that into our own perspectives and the language that we use to share those incidents. I can't hear you, Bud.
Thank you. Sorry. Any other questions for Bob? We ask that you'd put in the chat box. It doesn't appear as though we have additional questions, and we want to just give you a reminder, if you're interested in additional information about Religion Communicators Council, you can visit religioncommunicators.org for information about the January 26th conference in Los Angeles or the annual convention in Atlanta for April 5th through the 7th. Do encourage you to take a look on the Intersections International website to look at the Peacemaking Pakistan work, and I did provide you a link to that there in the chat box if you have access to it. I also encourage you to look at robertjchase.com. There's information about Beyond the Comma, links to information about the book and the talks that Bob is giving about it, workshops, presentation, and so forth. A lot more background and connections. Thanks to Betsy McKaylee for joining us today as well, Bob referenced earlier. So thank you everyone for being on and for participating in this webinar, especially to Bob for taking time. He had a lot of adversity this morning to try to get to a computer that was working in order to make this happen because he had lost power and everything else where he was at. So it was terrific to have him on board. We do have a final question for you from Art. What do we do today with the interpretation of events nationally and internationally for the purposes of creating division, hatred, and possibly war? So what do we do today with the interpretation of events nationally and internationally for the purpose of creating division, hatred, and possibly war? I think he's asking us to respond to the current situation we have. There's so much tension, thick tension in the air in our society.
Yes, and I think that is such a profound question. I will leave that to each of us to begin to answer that in our own ways. But the urgency is very pressing. And if nothing else, we need to be aware of that and ask ourselves what is right down the road, what comes next, and be prepared for whatever that might be. So we bring hope to that conversation, but we also want to bring a realistic understanding that this acrimonious kind of atmosphere that exists in our country today and even throughout the world is something that has very serious consequences and needs us to act as peacemakers wherever we might be. Let me
said earlier about the role of responsibility that we have, basically to see ourselves as actors in the midst of it, as giving shape to the story, of telling the story truthfully and following some of the principles that you had outlined.
That's right.
Seeing ourselves as bystanders, but helping to shape it. And it's interesting because so much of it seems to be fueled exactly by tools of communication, like what somebody just posted on Twitter or what have you.
Right, exactly. So let me just add my words to Bud's of thanks to each of you for participating. It's been a real privilege and honor to do this, and definitely worth the technological struggles we had to get to this point. But thank you so much for participating. And Bud says that this will be posted on the RCC site. So for you all, if you should want to see parts of this again, or let your own networks and communities know about this, there will be a way to see it in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.